I used to wait for Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Lunchtime, he had an hour that he saw people. So I wait in the waiting room. And once in a while, I'd hear him say, I don't really know you. I can't give you advice. That is the fine line between Gadol worship and not Gadol worship. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach made it very clear, I'm a human being. If I don't know you in this particular case, I can't give you advice. Today, we don't look at it that way. We look, I'm going to the Gadol Torah. He doesn't have to know me. He's just going to spout out something, and it's going to be good advice. Why does Shlomo Zalman say that if that's the case? What, he wasn't a Gadol Torah? Obviously, he felt that al pi teva, I have to know the person.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. For the past 2,000 years, Torah-observant Jews have acknowledged that our greatest scholars deserve respect and have an extraordinarily deep and broad understanding of the vast sea of the Torah sheba'al peh, the oral law. In recent times, however, proper respect for talmidei chachamim, for scholars, has often morphed into a pseudo-idolatry of gedolim, where they are seen not just as great experts in Torah, but also as oracles who are, for all intents and purposes, close to infallible. Now, there's no question that most people who ascribe to this kind of Gadol worship would deny that these scholars are infallible, or that the term Gadol worship is appropriate at all, or that their attitudes towards gedolim are new. Indeed, I have heard it said multiple times that extreme respect for gedolei Torah has been one of the fundamentals of Torah Judaism for 2,000 years. But to many of us, it seems apparent that this is an historical anomaly and a huge change from the way things used to be, and the consequences are potentially dire. Rav Yitzchak Shurin was one of my teachers, and like many of his students, I was enthralled with his personal stories of interactions with his grandfather, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal, as well as many other gedolim of the previous generation. He has had strong personal relationships with gedolei Torah, and has also witnessed how things have changed over the past half-century. There are few people as well equipped to discuss the phenomenon of over-the-top reverence of gedolim than Rav Shurin, and I was honored that he agreed to share his perspectives on today's podcast. We'll get to that conversation shortly. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Continue the discussion on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a very high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. For over 40 years, Rabbi Yitzchak Shurin has helped guide thousands of women in their journey to a more enriched Jewish life. Rabbi Shurin is the grandson of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal and had a very close, special relationship with his grandfather. Originally from New York, Rav Shurin learned in the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva under Rav Yitzchak Hutner Zatzal. In addition to his illustrious background, Rabbi Shurin holds an advanced degree in guidance and counseling from Nova University. He has lived in Israel since 1977 and resides in the Givat Zeb neighborhood of Yerushalayim with his wife, Esther. Rav Yitzchak Shurin, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Rav Shurin, I've been troubled, as many of us, maybe outside the Haredi world, maybe also inside the Haredi world, I don't know, by the increasing importance in some ways of gedolim in parts of that world. Meaning, to put a negative spin on it, and perhaps we'll hear both sides, what might be called Gadol worship, or giving undue responsibility to them, undue respect to them. Not that they shouldn't be respected, but perhaps going overboard. And before we start with anything else, do you see this as an issue as well in the Haredi world?
I see it as an issue, yes, in the Haredi world. Do I see it in the Dati Lumi world? I don't see it so much in the Dati Lumi world, but I see a little bit of another problem, like sort of the other extreme is when everybody agrees that there are times when you have to confer with a great Torah giant or with at least a chashuv rav, right? And I see in the modern Orthodox world that sometimes they're a little bit slow on that. they can try to figure it out themselves, so to speak.
Right. I think that's true. In fact, I also argue that in sectors of the religious Zionist world, though, particularly in Israel, I think there are segments which are moving towards that Haredi-style Gadol worship on some level.
Correct. You are correct. It's mostly Chardal, but they are moving towards because it's really Hasidus, the Hasidic Rebbe, that's really the foundation, I have a feeling, of all of that. And we've become moving a little bit more, or not even a little more and more towards that Hasidic type of approach. And I think I understand why in this generation, as opposed to the previous generations, because I grew up with Gedolei Torah, and I didn't have the same relationship with those Gedolei Torah, even though the Gedolei Torah I saw were quite great. I didn't have the same, like when you call it Gadol worship, I certainly didn't have that, even though, like you said, I had an immense amount of respect for them. But I think there's a fine line between immense amount of respect and becoming an avodah zarah.
Okay, then let's talk about that specifically. Let's talk about what it means to respect a gadol properly and when it turns into, at least idiomatically, a kind of avodah zarah, idolatry.
Okay, excellent. It's an excellent question. So, maybe I want to give an introduction a little bit, because I think we should really know about this generation. And when I talk about this generation, I'm not only referring to the ultra-Orthodox or even the modern Orthodox. I think people in general in the world today, and I think you see it on university campuses as well, are less independent thinkers than they used to be. They're more uncertain about issues. Their parents do everything for them, so they don't have to think about things. They get to university and they have to think about things because their parents are not there, and they fall apart because of it. And books, I think, have been written about this. I think I remember reading one book called Coddling of the American Mind. And it sort of says it there, is that, we're breeding a new, very dependent generation. And, my grandfather had a saying, Vies Christelze Chazoyidlze, meaning the way it is in the Christian world, that's what's going to happen in the Jewish world. And don't think that you're isolated from it. You're not.
And you're referring to your grandfather, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, that's all.
Correct, Rav Yaakov. He always used to say that people think that the ultra-Orthodox world is isolated. It's not really true. It seeps in without any question. So I think we're dealing with a society today, worldwide, that doesn't know what to do, right? They're just clueless about many things. People on campus don't even want to hear another opinion because it gets them, it triggers them. That's the famous word. So they don't want to hear it. But so what they did in the religious world is they found something, right, which you have called the Gadol worship. So I don't know what to do. And now I have a religious legal reason to make this person my Gadol. The people in the secular world don't have a Gadol, unfortunately, but I have one. So now I can be very extreme about it, because we tend to be extreme.
Let's go back to that question I asked then. When does it change to Gadol worship from simply giving proper respect to someone who's a Gadol b'Torah?
I think, like all changes, it was slow. I think it basically started probably in the late 1970s, but very slowly you began to see that it's broken all its boundaries, probably around the year 2000. But I already saw it before, but it just got completely out of hand, where people, forget about going to a Gadol, for an Eitzah to get a, advice for a Gadol. They went into Reb Chaim Kanievsky to get a bracha, and I think he had this gematria, not a gematria, but he had this Rashi Tevis, Abu. He didn't even have time, because thousands of people. That didn't exist when I was growing up, that idea. And that's part of the Gadol worship, right? It's part of Gadol worship is that I go for a Gadol for a bracha, okay. But, the person is not going to even sit down with you. When someone came to Rabbi Yaakov for a bracha, he sat down with them. He said, okay, what do you need a bracha for, right? He didn't even have time. It was like, I asked people. Some people actually said to me, I was very disappointed. So that's already when you're making, and again, I have nothing against Chas v'Shalom or Chaim Kanievsky. He was a Gadol b'Torah. But this type of relationship with the Jewish people, I don't believe that Rabbi Yaakov or Rabbi Moshe or Rabbi Yosheber Soloveitchik or many of the others, right? Even Avram Shapiro today, Americans, they wouldn't have bought into such a thing. You want to speak to a Gadol Batorah, you come and you talk things through, and we'll talk a little bit about how you have to talk things through, and I have many sources for that as well. But my point is that we've come to a place where we've just thrown up our arms and given everything over to the Gadol Batorah, our whole lives over to the Gadol Batorah, and that's a little bit like I give over my whole life to God. That's it, right? A Gadol Batorah, I don't give my whole life over to. He's a human being, and that's what we talk about with the fine line of the Gadol Batorah not being the human being anymore. And again, let's say he even says Ruach HaKodesh, but he's a human being. And we have to know, not every Gadol may have Ruach HaKodesh. My grandfather said to me, he said this to me, he said, I think the Chavetz Chaim had Ruach HaKodesh. But if you tell me that Reb Chaim Brisker had Ruach HaKodesh, I'll be surprised. Now, Reb Chaim was a tzaddik yisod olam, but he said to me, it's a different type of personality. Reb Chaim wasn't looking for Ruach HaKodesh. That's that one.
That's very interesting. I want to ask a little more about these symptoms, because one of the things you're saying, Rav Shurin, that is ironic almost, is the fact that people are giving their whole lives over to the gedolim. And this is before my time, but it seems to me that in the earlier times, meaning the 1960s, 1970s perhaps, to go to a Gadol, they're pretty accessible. I used to hear stories about going to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in the 80s and 90s. I never had the zechut to go myself, but he was available. You go into his apartment and you wait. And now, ironically, when people are giving their whole lives, so to speak, over to gedolim, it's almost impossible to reach them. There are handlers and layers of protection around them.
Correct. But I'm not sure what came first, the chicken or the egg. And it was with regard to these gedolim that you just go in and go out. Right? You obviously are not going to be able to ask them advice because you don't have 30 seconds in there, right? So you're getting this bracha, which again, the bracha is somehow or another something beyond logic. Beyond. It's not that I'm against brachas, but that's not what we use gedolim, except in very rare cases. People came to Rabbi Yaakov before they get married, to Rav Moshe before they got married for a bracha. But again, Rav Moshe and Rabbi Yaakov sat down with them and said, "What do you?" He was interested. I'm going to tell you something very interesting. I heard a number of times. I used to wait for Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He had lunchtime. He had an hour that he saw people, so I wait in the waiting room. And once in a while, I'd hear him say, "I don't really know you. I can't give you advice." That is the fine line between Gadol worship and not Gadol worship. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach made it very clear, I'm a human being. If I don't know you in this particular case, I can't give you advice. Today, we don't look at it that way. We look, I'm going to the Gadol Batorah. He doesn't have to know me. He's just going to spout out something, and it's going to be good advice. Why does Shlomo Zalman say that if that's the case? What, he wasn't a Gadol Batorah? Obviously, he felt that al pi tev, I have to know the person.
I have to say that what you're saying right now resonates so much. At the same time, one of the issues I think actually goes even beyond that. It's not just that, and I say b'mchil kvodam, it's not just that they don't necessarily know the person, but they sometimes will issue a ruling about a public policy issue when their only information, it seems to me, from my perspective, from what I've seen, is coming from a subjective source. In other words, I'll give not a particular example, but an example we've seen many times where a candidate for mayor of one of the cities in Israel will go to a Gadol Batorah, who's then told by his handler, this is the person who's running for mayor, he's the Haredi candidate, and the other candidate isn't from. That may or may not be true. And then the Gadol Batorah will say, yes, it's a chiyuv to vote for this particular person. It's not just that they don't have all the information, it's that the information they're being given is, by definition, not just subjective, but perhaps even false. And beyond that, how do they, dare to rule on something until they say, I would hope they would say, I can't say you have to vote for this candidate until I've spoken to the other candidate too. What's up with that?
I'll tell you, what I'm feeling is that the gedolim also somewhat got sucked into this as well. Okay? It's not just one-sided by the people making them, a deity, a deity, but it's actually that the Gadol Batorah is also getting sucked. Now, part of the reason he gets sucked in, by the way, is because they're going to him so much, he really doesn't have time to do research on all these subjects. With Rabbi Yaakov, Rav Moshe, and Rav Henkin, you were able to, people didn't come so often. I mean, they came regularly, but not so often. Rabbi Yaakov used to do research on the subject. But if you're going to the Gadol so much, he doesn't have time for it. So he's got to listen to another opinion. The minute he listens to another opinion, it's going to be clouded. It's going to be colored in some way. And I can tell you that Rabbi Yaakov, when it was a big issue, he went to the source. He didn't, someone could tell him something, but he said, I can't say anything until I research it. And I think the same was true with Rav Moshe. But you are right. The gedolim in Eretz Yisrael, and there were times when even Rabbi Yaakov simply laughed about it. He said that this Gadol is going to get into a lot of trouble. He said, because he was listening to one side and he didn't really hear what was 100% true, And by the way, a lot of times the Gadol Batorah reacted and said, I made a mistake here. I know one case where the Gadol Batorah said he was a real Gadol Batorah, and he says, I made a mistake. I just believed my Talmud, and maybe I shouldn't have.
I mean, maybe I'm being naive here, Rev Shurin, but I would think that a Gadol Batorah would understand in Dinei Choshen Mishpat, and presumably in most situations where there are two parties, it's not just that you only believe one side because that's all the information you have. You're not allowed to give psak unless you hear both sides.
Correct. That is true. I have a feeling that you are correct, but the guy was a very close talmid of this particular Gadol. And, he always believed him, and he wants the best for Klal Yisrael. And by the way, the Talmud is not, his agenda is not that he wants the best for Klal Yisrael. He thinks he knows the best for Klal Yisrael, but he really doesn't know the best for Klal Yisrael.
Right.
So I'll tell you a story, but I'm going to stay without, am I going to say the story without a name? I'll say it without a name. Professor Lev, you've heard of Professor Zev Lev. He opened up the Lev Institute. Professor Lev was a talmid of Rabbi Yaakov, and he was an Ilui Otzim. He was a physicist that, if I'm not mistaken, Ben Gurion invited him to Israel in the 1950s to help create the unofficial atomic weapon, okay? Now, when he opened up Machon Lev, a Gadol Batorah put it in Cherem. So Professor Lev called my grandfather, and he says, what do I do? He's a real Gadol Batorah. How do I react? So Rabbi Yaakov said to him, this is what Rabbi Yaakov told me. I said to him, take him to Din Torah. In other words, if you think that he's incorrect because he's saying that guys from yeshivas are going to go to his institute instead of staying in yeshiva, and you know that's not true, because first you have to go to the army in order to go to the Lev Institute at that time. So take him to Din Torah. So he went to the Rabbanut in Yerushalayim, and he got a tzav, and he sent the Rabbanut sent the letter to Din Torah. Okay, and I remember my grandfather saying to me, he was laughing when he said it, but he said it in Yiddish, but I'll say it in English. He's going to regret he started up with Willie. Professor Lev was known as Willie Lev. He's going to regret that he started up with Willie. Now, what happened? This Gadol got a tzav. He's never gotten a hazmanah to Din Torah. So he right away called up Professor Lev, and he says, like, what's going on over here? He says, well, you were Motzi Shemra on my school and on myself, and I feel the only way to correct this, take you to the Torah. He says, but why couldn't you call me before we had to do it? So he says, how come the Rav didn't call me before he said it, right? How come the Rav didn't have what to answer, right? So that, you're right. This is the problem. The problem is that there's some gedolim, and I don't think it's out of just negligence or laziness. I think they don't have the time. Some of them don't want to stop learning, which is not good. They don't want to be mevatel. If you don't want to be mevatel Torah, I feel don't paskin. I mean, you can paskin halacha, but when we talk about bigger hashkafic issues, say, look, I'm not going to get involved in that. I can't tell you, right? And if you do decide to do it, let's learn through the whole sugya.
All right. There's another thing which I think is also related to this, perhaps. Sometimes I think that, at least with certain gedolim in Eretz Yisrael, part of the problem is their age. Now, the Rambam says in his Hilchot Sanhedrin that someone who is extremely old define as you will, is not allowed to be on the Sanhedrin. Now, obviously, we're not talking about a Sanhedrin, but as a value, the same idea applies. The Rambam says, if you're too old, you shouldn't be on. I believe that Rashi, quoting the Gemara there, the Gemara Maseches Sanhedrin, says the reason is because when you get old, you become cruel because you lose some aspect of your mercy. You forget what it's like, perhaps. If I want to be a little bit more flippant, I could say maybe it's understood mimela automatically that when you get old, some people, as I say, lose a few miles off their fastball. They can still be very brilliant, but they're not quite the same as they were and as sharp as when they were younger.
100%.
And I actually did some research and looking up the person who's considered the head of UTJ or whatever, the various Rabbanim, over and over and over and over. There's not been somebody ever, I think, under 80. They're often over 90 or over 100, even when they're appointed. I don't mean they're appointed when they're 50 and then continue in that position. I mean, they become the Gadol, quote unquote, the Gadol Hador when they're 97 years old. I don't even understand, unless someone is trying to use them for their own purposes, the concept of a Gadol who's 97 years old as being, that's when he becomes, so to speak, the Gadol Hador in the public mind is ridiculous.
Of course. Look, I'm not so familiar with the Gedolei Torah of today, but I could tell you that, someone like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, people went to him already when he was probably in his 50s or 60s. They were already going to him. I think he lived into his early 80s, if I remember correctly. Or Zalman Nechemya Goldberg also lived into. I used to go to Zalman Nechemya almost every week until he was already his head was actually still working, but he was getting older and more like he didn't have the koach that he had, right? And I remember after my grandfather's stroke, my grandfather wouldn't give advice. He said, and even before the stroke, I remember one time I met Rav Gustman, who was a real Gadol Batorah, and he said to me, I want you to know that your grandfather called me this week, and he said they came with a shaila to me about in Ilchas Ishas. I'm already in my 90s. And I said, my memory is not as good. I'll only paskin if Rav Gustman agrees with me. So the couple is going to call you, and you'll have to decide whether I'm right or wrong. And Rav Gustman smiled, and he said, I didn't answer right away. I wanted to think it through, but then I agreed with your grandfather. That's what he said. But Rabbi Yaakov thought also that he's getting older. The memory is not as good as it was. And then I'm talking psak halacha here, right? Hashkafa may be a little bit different, but again, you also lose a certain balance of that when you get older, and it has to be taken into account. And again, I don't know if it's the gedolim's problem here or people are taking advantage of the gedolim because they're older. Okay, there's a lot of people out there who I don't trust. I trust the gedolim, but I don't trust those people who are the spokesman for the gedolim.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Let me ask you then, Rav Shurin, if you can define the other side, what is a Gadol in your mind supposed to be? What is his place, so to speak, in the minds of Klal Yisrael? We have gedolim. We have respect for gedolim. How much authority nowadays should a Gadol have? Not what we actually have, but what should it be?
Right. So let me explain. First of all, we have to realize one of the problems of Gadol worship means automatically this Gadol knows everything. He can say nothing that's wrong. He nothing, right? He's got expertise in everything. That's not necessarily true. I just want to give you sort of like an example. When it came to psak halacha, when I was growing up, Ramosha was the last stop, Ramosha Feinstein. But when it came to Eitzot, I know people who said, Reb Beryl Wine, who just recently turned 90, right, always used to say, I go to Rabbi Yaakov. He is Chakima de Yehudai. He's the wise one of the Jewish people. Now, it doesn't mean that Moshe Feinstein wasn't wise, but if you talk about expertise, people have certain expertise in certain areas, and Shikul Hadas, a balance. And Rabbi Yaakov was really much more known as you go for an Eitzah than for a Psak Halacha, even though I know tons of people went for Psak Halacha, but he was known as Eitzah. In Torah Masori, he was known in the Aguda, right? He was known, and even by Reb Moshe, he was known like that. So you have to know if a Gadol is a deity, then he's a god. So God is good at everything. But if he's not a deity, we go to that person for what they're really good at. So that's really the first step of defining a Gadol is we know that Reb Moshe was outstanding in Psak Halacha. We don't need to prove that. We know that Rabbi Yaakov gives tremendous eitzes to different people, and people wrote, in their own svarim, they wrote the eitzes they got from Rabbi Yaakov. I'm going to tell you something interesting. I'm being very careful over here. Rabbi Lichtenstein, Zochrono Livracha, told me before I went to Eretz Yisrael and decided to come there, I spoke to Rabbi Yaakov. And I was shocked when he told me that. He said, because people said that the eights is about life, you have to go to Rabbi Yaakov.
Rabbi Aaron said, talk to your grandfather first. That's what he said?
Yeah. And Rabbi Aaron wasn't exactly what we call like, he in a sense, he was Haredi, but in another sense, he was very Dati Lumi. But a lot of people came with knitted kippot, even though, Rabbi Aaron wore a black kippot, but a lot of people came with knitted kippot to Rabbi Yaakov as well, because they knew that Rabbi Yaakov, they used to say about Rabbi Yaakov, he doesn't have self-interest. When you're sitting in front of him, he has self-interest, but when you're sitting in front of him, he's thinking about you. He's not thinking about him. And that's important. When you talk about a Gadol b'Torah, that's an extremely important idea, that there's no I'm a Gouda. Rabbi Lichtenstein is not a Gouda. He's Mizrahi. By Rabbi Yaakov, what he did is he put his head into Rabbi Lichtenstein. He sat and he listened to him. He knew where he was coming from because he knew who he was, right? And he spoke his chachma for Rabbi Aaron. Maybe for someone else, he would have spoke differently. That's a real Gadol b'Torah. A Gadol b'Torah that has an agenda, to me, that's a question about his godless. So I have a high standard. And so Rabbi Lichtenstein told me he has a high standard for a Gadol b'Torah. He said that to me, right? My standards are very high. And I also have a high standard. But that's what one basic idea is, no self-interest, right? That's a Gadol b'Torah. And that's what he said. I went to Rabbi Yaakov to speak to Rabbi Yaakov. I'm sure he spoke to Rabbi Yoshe Ber also, his father-in-law. But he felt in Eitzah, by the way, I have to tell you this, and I'm going to show you the sources for this. In Eitzah, the Mishnah in Ovo says, Mar be'Eitzah, Mar be'Tvuna. You don't go to one person. This whole idea of going to one Gadol for everything, for your one Gadol. In Psak Halacha, you ask even a Rav. You can't ask another Rav unless you get permission to ask another Rav, right? But or if you say to the Rav, I just want your advice, I don't necessarily want a Psak. So keeping away from Psak Halacha, I'm talking about Eitzah. I'm going to read you what someone writes about Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Binyonei hashkafa lo shayach chiyav leleches l'rav echad ubechol inyan yochol tamid l'shol et mishu rotzeh. In matters of hashkafa, a Jewish outlook, it's not possible to obligate someone to go to one Rav. And in every matter that he speaks about, he can constantly go to different people. Why does he go to different people? Because one has expertise in Y, one has expertise in Z. So again, a Gadol b'Torah is also a person that says, I don't have expertise in X, Y, and Z. So you can't really come, to me about that. But what I'm going to show you is Mar Beitz and Mar B'Tvuna, Margala B'Pumye Te'inish, the Reb Chaim Volozhin in his Pirkei Avos. It is a saying in the mouth of people, Sha'al Eitzav Aseh Kesich L'cha. Ask for an Eitzav, but do like you think. And what does he explain here? He says, you want an Eitzav because you want to get perspectives. Okay? But at the end of the day, no one knows you like you know yourself. He writes this. I know today this would be Apikursus, but I'm sorry, right? He writes it. So I go by this. I asked a lot of gedolim, eitzes. Sometimes I thought one gadol was better for an eitzah than another gadol, and I went to more than one gadol to ask an eitzah and see what he says. And Reb Shlomo Zalman, I didn't even know this Reb Shlomo Zalman. I saw this later, but he backs me up completely on this.
I mean, the strange thing here is that I think Rav Shurin, and you can tell me if you agree with this or disagree, part of the problem from my perspective, my limited perspective, is that I think people don't know what questions to ask. I'm going to tell you, if you don't mind, it's a 2-minute story, sure, but I think it's worthwhile.
Sure, go ahead.
When my wife and I were selling our house to move into where we are now, selling our old apartment, we had already decided to buy our current house. We've been here for about 20 years. And then we had to sell the old house. The problem was no one was coming to buy it. And at a certain point, someone showed up, looked at it, and then they didn't come back for a couple months. A couple months later, they came back again. We had no other buyers in the interim. They came back after a couple months. The first time they came was Sukkot, and then they came back Hanukkah time. My wife, Elise, was saying, they're going to buy it. I know it because why would they come back? And they looked at it and they said, okay, we want to buy the house. There's one condition, however. The real estate agent conveyed this to us. What's the one condition? The one condition is that our aliyah rights are up right around now. So we'd like you to predate the sale on the contract to say that it happened a month ago. So let's say we're December 1st. Let's instead say it happened November 1st, because by predating the sale, we'll still have our aliyah rights. And I said, well, is that a ma'akev? Is that something which will cancel the sale if we won't do it? And they said yes. Now, as we know, aside from defrauding the government, it's also star mukdam. It's predating a check or predating a contract, which is completely invalid al pi halacha. So we couldn't do it. We said, okay, we're not going to do it. Happened to be the next day we found someone to buy our house. So that's the art scroll version of the story, and it's true. But here's the part that I wanted to emphasize. The question is, why did they come in Sukkot and then didn't come for 2 more months? Why did they wait until Hanukkah? They asked their Rav, are they allowed to move to our street, which may not have been frum enough? This isn't Ramat Beit Shemesh. It may not have been a frum enough street, and the Rav said, better not. And then when they couldn't find any other apartment that was good enough for them, after 2 months, he said, okay, I guess there's no choice, so you're allowed to go and buy that apartment. Think of what happened over here. They thought to ask a Rav whether they could move to a fully Shomer Shabbos street in Ramat Beit Shemesh, but it's not Haredi enough. But they didn't think about asking him about Dinei Choshen Mishpat, about writing a contract and predating it and defrauding the government and violating halacha.
Beautiful.
People don't know what questions to ask.
Right. They actually don't know. And again, I wonder about a Rav that automatically says, if you're moving into a non-Haredi area, don't move in. I wonder about that, Rav. We're not talking here about moving into a neighborhood where they're all non-Jews, even though the Gemara does say that it's better to live in Israel in an area it's all non-Jews. But I'm talking about not just Jews, but from Jews, right? So now the Rav tells them not to do that. But did the Rav take into account, my question is, did he take into account the fact that they really loved the apartment, right? And the raya is they came back. So you have to take that into account also. So I think you're right. You have to know, how to ask a question. But I want to read you something by Shlomo Volba. I think it's important that I read this for you. A Talmud writes this, okay? So again, this is where I'm backing up your idea. Moran HaMashkiach Shlita Omer. The Mashkiach said like this, and this is what the Talmud is writing. Ki lifnei she'atalmid holech l'shol et rabo, olav lachshov ala inyan hanidon ba'atzmo. He has to think about the whole matter by himself before he goes. I have a question, I run to the rabbi. No, Shlomo Volba says, think it through. Ladun bo al kol tzadav, to think about all the different possibilities and sides of the issue. Ki'ilu nimtza be'i boded, as if he's living on an island alone. I can't get more extreme than this. For olav lachlit below ezrach chitzoni, and he has to decide automatically without going to the Gadol. Okay, rak la'achar avodam meumetzes zu ulachar shigia lachra atzmit. After he works hard and he sees all the different sides, and after he comes to his conclusion, yigashal rabo v'yivtuk es hachroso. Then he should see. I want to get a Torah perspective. I want to see if I have it, right? So Rav Shlomo Volba says, Yivarer b'mashatah, elu shikulim hichzir, yismach b'chelko, ki yitzliach l'chavim l'das harav, right? So the problem is they're not thinking. I would have presented the question is, I don't think I could get another beautiful apartment like this. And I researched the block, and I see there's people with knitted kippot, but they're b'nei Torah, right? I know did he redo the research, or did they very superficially decide, if they're wearing knitted kippot, so of course we can't live here. And again, the whole concept of not living with a knitted kippah, that in itself is, forget about what we're talking about, the period of the different groups here in Israel, which is much more extreme than in America. That's in itself a problem that you have to have a different, we have to have a different discussion about.
For sure. And part of my problem with that whole story, and many others like it, when people go to Rabbanim for questions that privately I'd say, wow, that doesn't sound to me like something that should be up to the Rav. My problem isn't so much that they ask the Rav, because they may not know. The problem is the Rav is willing to answer them. I would hope the Rav would say, that's up to you. I can help you work it through. I heard Rav Soloveitchik used to do the following when people ask him questions of that sort. He would say, I can help you work it through. If you do this, this is likely to happen. If you do this, this is likely to happen. But that's very different from saying, this is what you should do. I think there's certain things that you have to say, it really is up to you. I can't answer that for you. I can only help you work it out.
I'm going to read you for a second what Rev Breitowitz Shlita wrote. You know Rev Breitowitz. I mean, he went to Harvard Law School. He became a judge eventually, a professor.
I had him on the podcast a few months ago.
I'm going to read you what he wrote about his bimiyatz with Rabbi Yaakov. In other words, Rav Ruderman said, listen to this. Rav Ruderman said, don't think I can make that decision for you whether you should go to Harvard or stay in Ner Yisrael. I think you should go to Rabbi Yaakov. I'm not going to go into the whole story with Rabbi Yaakov, but I'm going to go into the part that he writes about the Eitzah. My recollection is he wanted me to figure out, and he was there to make sure I saw all the different studim and shikulim.
All the different sides and ways of weighing it.
Here's a Gadol Bator. Shouldn't he have said to him, go, don't go? Not to waste the time. No, he wanted to hear all the different shikulim and make sure he's not making a mistake. I wouldn't say my path became self-evident to me, but he wanted me to think it out. Okay? That's Rabbi Breidowitz talking. Okay? A Gadol Bator is not necessarily going to decide for you. He's going to go, like you said, through the studim, like Rabbi Yosheber.
Now, I want to ask you, do you think part of the problem is what I would call an increasing emphasis on the externals of how you look, of places you live? I gave that example of the neighborhood, of certain the chitzoniot, as opposed to certain more internal aspects. I've heard that part of the problem might be that when everyone has to conform, when there's a certain emphasis on conformity, that leaves less room for individual opinion, less room for individual expression, and therefore, accordingly, the role of the Gadol who sets that standard becomes that much stronger. Do you think there's an aspect to that?
Correct. No question about it, that people are not able to express opinions, and therefore they're going to go to the Gadol Bator because they're going to get a haskama from him. What they hope is a haskama from him, when in reality, they could have expressed their opinion themselves. But of course, everything is questioned today because everything's black and white. So, how could you not go to a Gadol Bator about something, right? I want to tell you something that's very interesting. I used to go to Rav Shlomo Zalman, but once I brought my daughter to Rav Shlomo Zalman. And Rav Shlomo Zalman, you had to listen to every word he said. You could be medayik like a Ramban, okay? I went to Rav Shlomo Zalman, and I said there was a school that opened up called Beit Shulamit. And at that point, I think it still is, but it was a Chardal type of school, Haridi Lumi. And I said to Rav Shlomo Zalman, I think I want to send my daughter to Beit Shulamit. It's a new school, and they say that they go to the Rav of the old city, his Rav Nebenzahl, right? When they have a question about chinuch, about policy, they go to Rav Nebenzahl. So Rav Shlomo Zalman first, he made a quick joke. He said to me, who says that they follow everything? He says, when they want to ask, they ask. When they don't want to ask, they don't ask. He joked about that.
Okay.
But he then said to me, someone here came today from Beis Yaakov, from the Beis Yaakov system, to me today, Dafka, he said, and he spoke about Beit Shulamit, and I can't say anything now. Do what you want to do. So I said, I came to the Rav for an Eitzah, if I should send my daughter. He goes, do what you want to do. That's what he said. And then he asked me to leave the room.
Okay, what was that about?
So I went to my uncle, Nosson Kamenetsky, Zichrono Livracha, and I said to my uncle, I'll tell you what he said. He said, he can't say anything, do what you want to do. So my uncle said to me, Yitzchak, do you think if you want to send him to a regular Bet Sefer, not dati, just a regular Bet Sefer Chiloni, he would have said, do what you want to do? He said, do what you want to. I can't say, make your own decision here. That's what he was telling you. Okay? That's where Shlomo Zalman was, right? He said, you have to make your own decision. And we have to start thinking that way. We have to think about things like that.
I think part of the problem might also be, Rav Shurin, that at times, I'm using the term idolization or idolatry vis-a-vis the gedolim, but there really is a sense, obviously that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there is a sense of not treating them like human beings. I'm going to tell you a story that involves you. I don't know if you remember this, but back when Pesach Waliki and I were running Yesodei Torah, our yeshiva, there was one point, maybe about 12, 13 years ago, where I had this idea of, I was going to be in New York anyway, and I had an idea, what we'll do is I'll give a shiur, then after that, we'll have some pizza, and then we'll go to the Yankee game. Why not? It'll be a fun activity with me and some of the talmidim who are at YU. A couple talmidim heard about this and were very bothered. They respectfully said, we don't think it's right for one of our Reshei Yeshiva to go to a baseball game. Maybe they're right. I don't know. So Pesach and I called you and I told you the plan. And I remember your first reaction was that we're going to the Yankee game. You go, oh, who's playing? So I said, it's Yankees-Phillies. Go, oh, sounds like a good game. And it was. But then you spent about half an hour telling us how people don't treat rabbis anymore, and al chakam v'kama, how much more so gedolei Torah, like human beings. And you started telling about all of your experiences with Rav Yaakov and all these other gedolei Torah, people who then might have been younger and became gedolei Torah, or who were gedolei Torah, playing basketball or playing tennis or swimming with the guys, and how we've treated them and we've learned to treat rabbis like they're not human anymore. So I thought maybe you could comment about that a little bit.
Okay, so look, I think that's correct what you said. I think people are afraid of the fine line between treating them like human beings and treating them like gedolim. And that's not correct, but that's what they're afraid of. If they start treating like human beings, right, they might not treat them like gedolim anymore. But it was true what you said, where Yaakov went to Camp Arshraga, Torah camp, he went swimming with the guys. Now, Rabbi Yaakov at that time was at least 80 years old, and he went swimming with the guys. I'm not sure Rosh Hashivas would do that today. In fact, Rabbi Yaakov said to me, we were sitting under a tree learning, and I said to Rabbi Yaakov, Zabi, you could take your kapota off. It's, it was a warm day, under a tree in the Catskills. I said, you could take your kapota off. So he says, I'm embarrassed. So I say, why are you embarrassed? He says, the younger Rosh Hashivas don't take their kapotas off, so I'm embarrassed to take mine off. That's what he said. So my grandmother was standing there. She says, and he won't even wear short sleeve shirts anymore because the Rosh Hashivas are not, right? In other words, there's certain things that are going on that these older gedolim, they didn't have that shtick. I call it, they were before Matan Torah. I call it that. I say, Rav Moshe, Rav Yishaber, Rav Henkin, Rav Yaakov, and many others were before Matan Torah. Right now we have this new Matan Torah. It was like the second giving, so to speak, right? The Luchas HaShlishis, not HaShniyos, right? That they got. But they were very, very normal type people. I don't believe if you would have said to Rav Yaakov, I enjoy going to a ball game, that he would have said, it's pasnik. I don't think he would have said that. But today they have that type of thing. But I want to say something else here that I think is extremely important. The problem of making a Gadol Batorah into worshipping a Gadol Batorah can have very, very negative effects on Klal Yisrael.
Okay, what do you mean?
Okay, I'll explain. I have really a few different problems that come up if you make someone a deity, or if even I don't mean it in the extreme way. I mean even somewhat, right? If you make them if you start worshiping them, okay. And again, we're talking the difference between respect, great respect, and worshiping. One of the problems today why people don't catch on when you have a rabbi that is not all that he's made out to be, right? And he starts taking advantage. We know the cases where he takes advantage of women, okay? There's cases where he takes advantage of men too. I don't mean sexually. I mean, it has to do, I had one case where a rabbi took advantage of somebody with regard to monetary things because the rabbi had a certain interest, right? So the minute you make someone into you start worshiping someone, you can't see the problematic sides anymore. And therefore, that's how women fell for these rabbis, because the rabbi was holy. And I'm going across the board. I've seen this in the Haredi world. I've seen it in the Dati Lumi world, right? That these rabbis have become like these holy people. And therefore, since they're so holy, they can't be human anymore. So how can I accuse a rabbi who's so holy of being a human who has taivas, who has, he has these, what do you call it?
Human drives.
Human drives, exactly. Very well put, right? And I'll never forget, one person spoke and he said, a talmid of Shlomo Volba, and he said he went to Shlomo Volba when a certain Rosh Hashiva was caught being inappropriate, okay, with women. The Mashgiach's reaction, Shlomo Volba's reaction was, me and you have to learn a lot more musar, because we can fall into that too. Okay, that's the reaction of a Gadol Batorah. I'm not beyond it. I'm not above it, right? And part of the problem with making a person a deity is, and again, it's with Rabbanim, and most of the time it's not so much with Gedolei Torah because they're usually really on the straight and narrow, but it can be. Okay, certainly people who we make gedolei Torah. Sometimes we make them ourselves. They aren't necessarily, but we make them ourselves, and that could be a major problem with these people. Again, we have today Kabbalists, right? A Kabbalist automatically, he has this Ruach HaKodesh. He's a tzaddik automatically, and sometimes we're being fooled by that. It's not, it's not so simple. I had a case where a girl went to a Kabbalist with a friend, and she had gotten engaged, and she had told me about the engagement, told me about the guy, and I said, it sounds really good. She says, okay, very good. Then she comes back crying to me about a week later. She says, my friend convinced me to go to a Kabbalist, and he said the names don't match. You can't get married to this guy. So I said, I don't get it. He says, yeah. She said, I said, why did you ask him? You told me you were sure. Well, my friend said, just to be extra sure. There we come back to the problem of, why are you not sure? Why don't you have confidence in yourself, right? It was very clear. It was very objectively clear that this is a great guy. Now, they got married, and they're still married. Now, what happened to the Kabbalists? They're not going to tell you over that story about that Kabbalist. They're only going to tell you the ones where, it worked, so to speak. So this is another problem, that when you start worshiping, he can, I don't think I park my brain at the door, which you can't do.
Yeah, when you say you don't think, I'll tell you something that happened to me a few weeks ago. I was being interviewed jointly with somebody who's a very well-meaning person, a defender of the current system in the Haredi world, and we were talking about specifically the idea of the giyus, the draft of Haredim. What we said is not really important, but what bothered me was the response. When I would say, well, for example, there is a pasuk that says, Lo tamod al dam re'echa, you can't sit idly by, you can't stand by the blood of your neighbor, or whatever thing I might say. At one point he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but the words are accurate, he said, it's asinine and in fact insulting to imply that the gedolim don't know that pasuk. I never implied the gedolim don't know that pasuk. I meant that that's how we understand, at least on my side of the ledger, why it's important for people to go to the army. And the answer to almost everything was, yeah, well, we don't really care what the sources are. That's actually what he said. The gedolim say they shouldn't, and they know more than you and me, so therefore there's nothing to talk about. And when I spoke to a Rav of mine, he listened to this, and he was astounded. He said, is that how they learn a Tosfot? That when
I was going to say the
same thing, okay? Yeah. That when there's a question on Chazal, you say, how dare you ask that question? I was not trying to imply that because I know this pasuk, they somehow don't know that pasuk, or because I quoted a Rambam, they don't know that Rambam. I was asking, how would they explain this, which is how you have a Torah conversation. But instead, the conversation was essentially shut down with the argument from authority. You have to park your brain at the door, as you said.
Exactly. So you are 100% right. They're not thinking, okay? I don't have to think. He's giving me God's word, so to speak. But I'm allowed to ask a question, not in a chutzpahdik way. How does this Gadol answer Samad al Dam Re'acha? I'm allowed to ask that question. I can ask on Rov and Abaya, so I certainly can ask on a Gadol Batorah today. Not even a question, right? I certainly can do that.
Then, Rav Shurin, let me ask you. Obviously, we're not here to try and say the gedolim Batorah don't have a place. They obviously do have a place. Sure. What's the role of a Gadol Batorah now? What should his role be properly?
Again, I feel the idea of getting Torah perspective, someone who's really full of Torah, inculcated with Torah, and he's just a walking Sefer Torah, right? He can give you a Torah perspective. But the question is, what's the issue? In other words, there are gedolei Torah that can give you, they're broad enough to learn through different subjects, and they can give you a perspective about it. There are gedolim who aren't that broad and cannot, and this is something, again, with Gadol worship, there's no such thing as that. With Gadol worship, it means he doesn't need to learn through anything. He's just sitting learning Torah, now he knows everything. That's not really true. That's why I said at the beginning, there were gedolim that were good at one thing, not good at another thing, and they knew it, and they didn't.
It's true in the Gemara also.
Mix in those other 100%. 100%. You see that there were certain Tanoim and Amoraim that were more worldly, right? Rabbi Yoshua was more worldly. He became a certain spokesman for Klal Yisrael, which other gedolim weren't, because they didn't have the background and the broader knowledge that you need to be. So there are, I think there's room for gedolei Torah, but a lot of times there'll be certain gedolei Torah that are poskim. So of course, for psak halacha, if especially if it's a big issue, right, you should go to a Gadol Batorah. And again, by me, a Gadol Batorah knew when to be machmir and when not to be machmir. If he's always machmir, I wonder about it. But Shlomo Zalman understood that if I'm coming to him about something, I don't want a chumrah, I want a kula. Obviously, that's what I want. If he couldn't give it, he couldn't give it. I came to him, I said, I have a divorced student who just got divorced. She doesn't want to cover her hair. Okay. So Shlomo Zalman said a very interesting thing. He said to me like this. He said, I don't have broad enough shoulders to say it's mutter. It's only rabbinic. That I could tell you. I'm comfortable saying rabbinic, but I don't have enough broad shoulders. I said to him, so who does the Rav think has broad enough shoulders? So he gave me a name of another Gadol that I didn't go to, but she was going to Chicago. So I asked her to ask Reverence Soloveitchik, because my grandfather had told me that Reverence Soloveitchik is not only the posek in Chicago, I think he's the posek for the whole Midwest. That's what Reb Yaakov said. So I said, we go to Reb and Reb Aaron gave her a very interesting gates. I'm not going to go into it right now, but my point is that a Gadol Batorah knows, he knows I'm trying to get a kula. So he'll give me another name that maybe he'll paskin that way. A person who needs cover says, no, this is my psak, tough luck. No, Shlomo Zalman understood that I need a heter over here. He can't give it to me. Maybe someone else could give it to me.
I once heard a story of Rav Soloveitchik, something like this, Rav Yeshaber Soloveitchik. He said something like this, where it was an important medical shaila about a very controversial issue where apparently, from the story, he was strict on it. He was machmir. And the person called him up, the rabbi who needed an answer. His student called him up and said, I need an answer. And he said, look, call me back in an hour. And he called him back, and Rav Soloveitchik said, he said, I need the answer now. He said, okay, call me back in 20 minutes, which is his way of saying, I'm not going to give you an answer because I know you're not going to want my answer. It's basically saying, call somebody else, I suppose.
Right. That's it. A lot of times they'll say, in fact, they'll say to it, I can't give you a heter, call somebody else. Because they know you're an honest person. In other words, they know you're not trying to just get out of keeping something. There's a reason why you need this heter. So that's a Gadol Batorah. Gadol Batorah understands that.
Let me ask you, when is it right to ask your own Rav something who's not necessarily a Gadol Batorah, the Rav of your shul, the Rav of your community, the person you choose as your Rav, the Asay Lecha Rav, the one you chose, and when do you need to go to a Gadol Batorah? Is there any time specifically when it's not good enough to go to your Rav? Or should your Rav say, I'm not able to answer this question, you should go to a Gadol, or I'll go to a Gadol for you?
Well, that's really the best thing. And because I feel that a Rav, he becomes a Rav of a community, he should have a certain amount of, wherewithal to be able to know where his, he has to have psak halacha, that's for sure, right? And he should also know where he can give advice as well. And if he can't give advice, let's say to the extreme, he has to say, I can't give advice. I can give you psak halacha. I can't give you advice. But if he feels he can give advice because he's got the knowledge and the depth and the experience, right? So you can go to him. But I always want him to be able to say, listen, I have to ask a Gadol Batorah, because there are certain issues that you go to Gadol Torah. I'll give you an example, maybe just an example, right? I'm not going to go to just any Rav to ask him if a student of mine from Midrash Rochel can have a child on her own. She's 45 years old. She's not married, right? I don't think most Rabbanim are going to say mutter or aser, right? They're going to say, I'm not ready to answer that. By the way, I went to Rev Yeshua Neuvert, the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, and I asked him a very serious question about something, and he said, the only one who can answer that question is Reb Zalman Nechemia. I certainly can't. So you see that he was a Gadol Batorah, but he understood that type of question needs Reb Zalman Nechemia. He was in a different league, and he was in a different league. So my point over here is that, when I asked that question, I asked it to Reb Zalman Nechemia. I didn't ask it to the Rav of, my neighborhood or something like that, because I knew the Rav of my neighborhood is not going to be able to give me that answer, certainly on the spot. He's going to probably say, I'm going to go to a bigger Rav. So I went to the bigger Rav. There are certain questions, I don't know how to conceptualize this, but there are certain questions that we just know that, you're not going to, the Rav in your, when the Twin Towers came down, Reb Zalman Nechemia wrote the tshuva on being mater all the women to get married. I don't think anyone went to the Rav in his shul and said, a woman went and said, my husband's missing, can I get married? I don't think anyone, there's certain questions that you see are much bigger than yourself.
After I had this interaction with that person I mentioned before who said, how dare you question the gedolim, I actually put together a certain mashal, a certain metaphor, because he said, and I've heard other people such as Rav Aaron Feldman say, that the gedolim are comparable to medical specialists. And if you're ill, of course you have to go to a specialist. You'd be foolish to diagnose yourself on your own. And the gedolim in this case are comparable to the medical specialists. And I actually think that is not the Haredi way or the Gadol worshipping way. That's the way that in the world that's not that, the world that I'm part of, and what you're part of it, that's what we do. We say, in our world, of course, it would be foolish to diagnose yourself based on YouTube or Google. That's ridiculous. But I can go to a regular doctor. I don't need to go to the biggest specialist in the whole world for every single question. If it's a major, serious question that's not a normal thing, either I go to the specialist or my doctor will go to the specialist and he'll ask him. A better comparison for them, the Gadol worship, I said, it's not that they look at them as specialists in medicine. They look at them as members of the NBA All-Star team, and I'm a high school basketball player. If I think I can play on the same court as LeBron James, I'm an idiot. I'm just a fool. So I think that that's a better mashal for me.
Right. I think you're right. But again, I'm coming back to Rav Shlomo Wolbe says you have to think through every shaila. Again, Rav Shlomo Wolbe knows you're not, no kol Torah kula, shas bavli rishalmi, but he understands that you have to think it through because you have to know how to ask the question. Once you think it through, you'll get a certain clarity about the different studim that you didn't have before, even without being, knowing kol Torah kula. You have to really be thinking it through. So the same thing, like you're saying, you really have to think things through. And you speak to the Gadol, and the Gadol, by the way, will be much happier if you thought it through. And you give him the different studim, he'll actually be happier, And again, I've had times that Reb David Cohen in New York said to me, Reb Yitzchak, you didn't have to call me for that. You didn't have to call me for that. And he didn't answer the question. You should look at the Mr. Brewer, in other words. What are you calling me for that? And he's right. He's right. Leave the Gadol alone for the big questions. Because if I'm calling him, he's not going to have, if everybody's doing what I'm doing, he's not going to have time. And he needs to be ready for the big questions, And that's part of the problem. When they made someone like Reb Chaim Kanievsky, they made him like this deity. So of course everyone came in to worship him, like lahavdil, when they came to India to worship, right? They come and worship him, and that's it. For 1 second, they were able to talk to him. Who knows what's going to happen? They spoke to him 1 second. This is not a Litvish idea. Litvish idea is you walk in, you sit down, you have a question. If you don't have a need, don't bother the Gadol.
Right. So Rav Shurin, we're coming to the end of our time, but I have a question with 2 different parts I want to ask. I want to ask about, and particularly you as an educator, to ask about how we make sure that we inculcate diversity in thought, how we can simultaneously teach people to respect the gedolim and to understand that their Torah knowledge is tremendous, and at the same time to respect their own seichel hayashar, their own ability to think logically, such that their opinion is not worthless. So here are the 2 parts of the question. How can gedolim themselves develop students who are not all of one mind, so that you have a gadol and his students are all different types of people? That's one kind of question. And the second one is, we as educators, how do we teach our students not to become idolaters, not to become completely enthralled with a gadol such that they can't think for themselves anymore?
Right. I mean, the way they brought up the question to Rav Shlomo Wolbe here, it says, "Ha'im ein sakana ki ha'adam yafoch l'robot." That's the way they bring it.
Is there not a danger that a person will become a robot?
A robot. That's what you're saying. The person's going to become a robot, right? So I want to tell you that I know it's part of my definition of a Gadol Torah. When you ask me, how do you define it? Part of my definition of a Gadol Torah, we can have a whole other series about this, is the fact that he realizes that not everybody fits into a box. Okay? If he doesn't realize that, then he's not a Gadol Torah as far as I'm concerned. Okay? And all the gedolim that I knew from many years ago till recently, after I got to Israel, Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, Rav Sholi Yisraeli, right? These people knew that they don't fit into one box, and they respected all of them as long as they were honest Jews. They respect them even if they weren't part of their club, so to speak, right? And that's what, in other words, I'm not afraid of the Gedolei Torah, making everybody an individual. I'm afraid of the little guys doing that. That's my biggest fear, is to stand Rosh Hashivas or Rabbanim, right? They'll need, there's a place where the Maharal Miprad writes, and I have it over here. It says Aseh Lecha Rav, which really means you should always have a Rav at hand, because you will have a Shaila, and you shouldn't be pasking just on your own. You should have a Rav that you can ask. It doesn't say you should get for yourself a Talmud. A person shouldn't look for Talmid more to make himself a Rav. Lomar tilbod mimeni, right? That the Rav is looking to start a yeshiva, so everyone's going to learn from them, right? The Maharal is 100, and he says this, Kamosha Osam Bar Rotzotz Elu, and like they do in our lands here in Eastern Europe, right? That's what they do. The Knei Lecha Talmud, right? That's a problem. That means the person has an agenda, and he wants the Talmud to get his hashkafa. Not everyone's going to get that hashkafa. You got to understand there are different types of people. Not everybody needs that hashkafa. And I know that Rabbi Yaakov felt this way in learning. He used to take guys out of Shurin in Torah Vadas and say, look, I see you're not really growing from this Rebbe. And maybe you have to learn differently than this Rebbe, and therefore we have to rethink it. And there were people that Rabbi Yaakov didn't let go back to Shir. He said, you should learn this way, and I'm going to faher you. I'm going to test you to make sure you know the Gemara. But I'm going to tell you how to learn that will be good for you. In other words, Rabbi Yaakov understood that no two people are exactly alike, so they're not going to fit in. That's a Gadol b'Torah. A person who thinks that everybody has to think the same way and everybody's going to be the same way, that's not a Gadol b'Torah by me.
I'm sure, and this has been so interesting, and I was really looking forward to talking to you. As you know, I said to you before we went on the air that I was excited about this conversation. It has not disappointed. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone listening did as well. Thank you very much for joining me today, Rav Yitzchak Shurin.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.